Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be learning about the nervous system and the sense organs. Let's begin. So first of all, we're going to be looking at one main characteristic of living organisms. What is one main characteristic of living organisms? Is that they have the ability to respond to stimulus. Now what is stimulus? Stimulus is any environmental change that prompts a response. So for example, a change in temperature. So if we're sitting in a hot environment, the change in temperature is the stimulus, and then we have receptors. So now let's move on to receptors. What do receptors do? Receptors have to detect the stimulus in order to send signals for our body to provide a response. So this response is going to be accomplished by the effectors. So how does this work? So for example, let's say we have a change in temperature, okay? And then this change in temperature will be detected by receptors. So receptors detect this change. This change is what we call as the stimulus. Then these receptors are going to send signals, okay, to an effector. Now this effector can either be a muscle or a gland, okay? And then this effector is going to provide a response. So for example, change in temperature. Let's say the temperature became hot. So we have receptors that are going to detect this change in temperature, and then it's going to send signals to effector muscles. So for example, or glands, such as sweat glands, and that's why we start sweating in order to always have homeostasis in our body. Okay. Now this of course requires a lot of coordination. So we have two main organ systems, which are the nervous system and the endocrine system, and those two systems are responsible for this coordination in the body. But now we're going to be looking at mainly the nervous system. So the nervous system can be split into two parts. Those two parts are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now the central nervous system, as you guys can see, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, okay? While the peripheral nervous system connects the central nervous system, or the CNS, to the different body parts, okay? And of course, they connect them using nerves, okay? So nerves are link the CNS to the body. Now what are nerves? Okay, so nerves are cord-like bundles of nerve fibers, okay? Those are what nerves are, okay? They're made up of nerve fibers that of course carry electrical impulses, okay? Or we can call them neurons, okay? So nerves, or we can call them neurons. And now we're going to be looking at the structure of a neuron. Okay, so before we look at the structure of the neuron, the function of the central nervous system, of course, it processes and integrates information to generate an output or a response. We have the brain, controls body movement, memory, speech, and so on. While we have the spinal cord, it transmits information and mediates reflexes. And we're going to be looking later on what a reflex is. While the peripheral nervous system, as we mentioned before, it links the central nervous system to different parts of the body, and it is consisted of nerves and sensory receptors. Now also the peripheral nervous system is split into two parts. It's split into a somatic part and an autonomic. Somatic controls voluntary actions, while autonomic, think about it, autonomic, automatic, it regulates involuntary functions, okay? Now let's look at neurons. What are neurons? Neurons are the major type of cells that are found in the nervous system. What are they? What's their function? They're specialized to carry information quickly from one body part to another, of course in the form of electrical signals, which are known as nerve impulses. Now, neurons also share parts like other cells in our body, okay? So what do they share? They also contain a nucleus, they contain cytoplasm, and they also have most of the organelles. And those are all found in the cell body. We also have the axon, which carries impulses away and away from the sensory and towards effector, okay, or other neurons, and we have dendrites which receive impulses from other cells. Now I can explain this better using this visual. So over here you have your dendrites, okay? So those dendrites receive signals, okay? We call them sensory neurons. They receive signals and they're gonna transmit those signals, okay? Now here is that's our cell body, okay? This is just an example of a neuron, and we'll be looking at all three of those examples later on, but this is just one example. So here you have the cell body. In the middle, of course, you have the nucleus, and you also have the cytoplasm, and you have different organelles which are not shown in the diagram here. Now, as you can see, the impulse are traveling through this yellow. The yellow, we call it the axon, and look, the axon is going to extend to an effector, okay, or another neuron. And as you guys can see, those blue sheaths, we call those myelin sheaths, okay? And what is their function? Their function is to speed up the transmission, okay? So we said neurons are specialized cells to carry information from one body part to another in the form of electrical signals, okay? And we talked about dendrites, axons, and the cell body, okay? And we also talked about myelin sheaths. As we said, myelin sheaths insulate the axon, as you guys can see here. They insulate it and they speed up the signal speed. How do they do that? Because they create something called nodes of Ranvier, which allow saltatory conduction. That means jumping conduction, okay? So the impulses jump. That's why it is faster. As you guys can see here, you have, wait, okay, if you look here you have a gap, you have a gap, you have a gap. So the myelin sheath doesn't completely cover it. Those gaps are what we call them nodes of Ranvier, and the impulses are gonna jump. That's why that is saltatory conduction, okay? Now the sensory, motor, and relay neurons. Those are three examples of neurons, okay? So sensory, what is the function of each? Sensory transmits signals to the central nervous system, and we saw the structure of a sensory neuron, while interneurons or relay neurons, they connect the sensory to the motor. Think of the word relay. So you have sensory neuron, and then you have relay neuron, and then you have the motor neuron. Okay, so the sensory, from its name, sensory, it senses. So it senses and it receives the signal. It wants to transmit this signal to the motor neuron. But how does it transmit to the motor neuron? It first has to go to a relay neuron, and this relay neuron transmits the signal to a motor neuron, and of course the motor neuron transmits it to an effector, and that's how we have our response. Okay, so sensory transmits signals to the central nervous system. You have relay connects the sensory and motor neurons in the CNS, okay, and you have motor neurons, they send impulses from the CNS to effectors. Now let's look at a synapse. What is a synapse? So let's look at the diagram first of all. So here, this is what we call a synaptic transmission. As you guys can see, we have a pre-synaptic neuron and we have a post-synaptic neuron, and in the middle, we have some sort of a gap. So what's going to happen? So we're going to get the nerve impulse, okay? Now those we call them vesicles. What do these vesicles carry? As you guys can see, the orange dots, they carry neurotransmitters, okay? So they carry neurotransmitters. Now this nerve impulse is going to cause those vesicles to move and fuse with the membrane, and they're going to perform exocytosis, releasing those neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap, okay? And then on the post-synaptic neuron, we have receptors, okay? Those are receptors. Now those receptors, of course, are specific, and then these neurotransmitters are going to bind to the receptors. Once they bind to the receptors, they allow the continuation of the nerve impulse. So let's look at the definitions. So what is a synapse? A synapse enables impulse transmission between two neurons. We have the presynaptic neuron, which releases the neurotransmitters, as we saw, and we have the postsynaptic neuron, which the neurotransmitters bind to. Okay, so it receives and transmits the signal. And what are neurotransmitters? They are chemicals that enable signal transfer, okay, between two neurons. They are only found in the presynaptic neuron, and they are also found in vesicles and are released by exocytosis, as we explained here. Okay, this gap we can also call it synaptic cleft, just for extra information. Okay. Now, drugs. Okay, so how do drugs work? Drugs work usually on synapses. So what do? They mimic or block neurotransmitters. So what they can do is they can either block neurotransmitters from binding to the receptor, so we'll have no nerve impulse, or they're going to mimic the neurotransmitter and going to increase its concentration. This is going to lead an increase in binding, so an increased nerve impulse. Okay, this is just extra information for you guys. Now, what is a reflex arc? Okay, so reflex is usually a quick response. Whenever you think of reflex, think if I have a fire. Okay, so let's say this is a fire. If I bring my hand close, okay, this is the worst drawing of a hand, but let's say this is a hand, I bring it close, immediately I'm going to remove my hand. I'm not even going to think about it. Immediately my body reacts and removes my hand. This is what we call a reflex arc mechanism. So a reflex is a very rapid response to a stimulus. Of course, here, take a moment and guess what the stimulus is. So the stimulus, if you guess it right, it is the fire. The fire is the stimulus. Then once I put my hand near it, directly we're going to have a rapid response where I remove my hand. So reflex arc involves automatic responses. Of course, we have a receptor which senses the heat and then it's going to, and then you have the sensory neuron which transmits the information to a relay neuron, then to a motor neuron, then to the effector. Of course, the effector here is going to be the muscles of my hand withdrawing my hand away from the heat. That is what a reflex arc is. Now let's move on to sensory organs. Okay, sensory organs contain receptors. As from the word sensory, they sense. So of course, for them to be able to sense, they must contain receptors. We have different types of sensory organs. We have eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. Mainly, we're going to focus about the eyes and about the skin. So eyes, of course, they have light receptors. They're responsible for vision. While you have ears or sound, they have sound receptors responsible for hearing. Nose is for smell. Tongue is for detecting taste. And you have the skin, which detects touch, temperature, and pain. Now let's look at the eye structure and how it's able to control vision. So eyes have two types of light sensitive receptors. What are those two types of light sensitive receptors? They have rods and they have cones. Now what is the difference between those two? So rods have high sensitivity to light, however they only detect black and white colors and they do not form sharp images, okay? While cones are sensitive to bright light and they are also allow the perception. Okay, so they also allow perception of color and sharp images. Okay, that's why if you're in a dark room, you cannot say what color an object is. Okay, and you cannot form a sharp image because your rods are working in a dark room. However, if you enter a bright room, your cones are activated since they're sensitive to this bright light, and you're going to be able to perceive different colors and form sharp images. Now, three types of cones you have. They are sensitive. They can be sensitive to blue, green, or red light. Now let's look at the structure of the eye. Okay, so where are the cones and rods found? So cones and rods are found on the retina. Okay, so rods and cones are found where? They're found on the retina. Okay, now the retina is what? That's why we call the retina the light sensitive part of the eye, okay, because it contains the sensory receptors for light. Now, when light stimulates the rods and the cones, okay, so when light enters and it stimulates the rods and the cones that are found on the retina, what's going to happen? The optic nerve will carry a nerve impulse. As you see here, the optic nerve carries a nerve impulse, okay? This nerve impulse will carry it to the brain, allowing to produce a visual image. How does it do that? By analyzing the signals that are coming from the rods and the cones, which are the receptors, okay? And of course, the closer the light sensitive cones are to each other, the sharper the image will be formed by the brain, okay? Now what is the fovea? Here we have highest concentration of cones, okay? And of course, since we have the highest concentration of cones, we do not have rods in the fovea, okay? Now you also have something called the blind spot, which is not shown here on the diagram. However, the blind spot is the region of the retina where the optic nerve leaves the eye. So here the optic nerve leaves the eye. So here we're going to have the blind spot. And of course, why do we call it the blind spot? Because no light sensitive receptors are found in this region. So any light that falls on this region cannot be detected because we do not have receptors to be able to detect this light. Now we also have the choroid. What is the choroid? So the choroid is a black layer that absorbs excess light. Okay, so black layer that absorbs excess light that is scattered from the retina, and its function is to prevent blurry vision. And of course, it also contains many blood vessels. Now, what is the function of these blood vessels? Is to nourish the cells of the eye. Now, we also have the sclera. So the sclera is a white tough opaque outer layer. As you guys can see, it's the outer layer of the eye, and it's going to protect the eye. It's white and tough layer, protects the eye, and as you guys can see, it extends all the way to the front of the eye. At the front of the eye, the sclera is going to be covered by a membrane called the conjunctiva. Okay, this is a layer that's transparent and keeps the eye moist. Okay, we don't want the eye to be dry, so we have the conjunctiva, which is a thin membrane which keeps it moist. Now we also have the iris, which are a circular structure of the eye that encircles the black hole of the eye. Okay, this is what gives people eye color. Okay, so people with blue eyes is because of the iris. They are blue or green or whatever it is. And so you have the black spot, and then you have the iris surrounding it. This black spot is what we call the pupil. Okay, and the surrounding is what we call the iris, which gives the eye color. Okay, so guys, for the structure of the eye, you have to know each structure and the function of it. Okay, it's very important to know the structure and the function of each part. So also the cornea, you must also know the function of it, the pupil and the iris muscle and the lens, and etc. Okay, I'm just gonna go over them really quickly, but make sure you know them really well. So we said the cones and the rods are found on the retina. Retina is the light sensitive part of the eye. Once light stimulates the rods and cones, the optic nerve carries impulses to the brain so the brain can form an image. And of course, we said the closer the cones are, the sharper the image is going to be. And we said the fovea has the highest concentration of cones and also has no rods, while the blind spot, we said, has no light sensitive receptors. Okay, and make sure to know the other labeling of the eye and their functions. Okay, now we're going to be talking about accommodation in vision. Okay, so as you guys can see here, you have suspensory ligaments that are connected to the lens. Okay, now just a small note, what is the lens? The lens is a flexible structure that can change shape to focus light on the retina. So the function of the lens is to focus light on the retina. We want light to be focused on the retina. Why is that? Because on the retina we have the receptors, which are the rods and the cones. Okay, so we're going to we're going to change the shape of it using the suspensory ligaments, and that depends if we're viewing a near object or if we're viewing a far object. So what's going to happen? So uh, once we try to view a near object, the ciliary muscles are going to contract, suspensory ligaments will loosen up, so what will happen to the lens? It will become thicker. While if we're trying to view a far object, okay, while trying to view a distant object, what's going to happen? The ciliary muscles are going to relax, while the suspensory ligaments will contract and the lens will be pulled thinner. As you guys can see, between the near and far object, they're opposite to each other. So, and the ciliary muscles act opposite to suspensory ligaments. So if one contracts, the other relaxes or loosens. If one relaxes, the other contracts. Okay? So make sure to know the difference between when trying to view a near object and when trying to view a far object. Now we also have pupil reflex. So if you guys can try it out, go from a dark room into a bright room. It's going to take you a bit of time to adjust. Okay, that's because it's important because we don't want to damage our eyes. So pupil reflex regulates the amount of light enters our eye. So if we enter a bright room, you're going to see that your iris muscles are going to contract, causing a constriction. Okay, while if I enter a dark room, my eyes will dilate. Okay, that is also because of the iris muscles. They're going to relax and going to expand, allowing this dilation to be able to view our environment or our surrounding more because there is not enough light. Okay, that is what pupil reflex is. Now the other sensory organ that we want to talk about is the structure of the skin. What is the skin? The skin has multiple layers. Of course, it has the epidermis, which is the outermost layer. Then we have the dermis, and then we have the hypodermis. The epidermis is the outer protective layer, while the dermis contains blood vessels and nerves, and the hypodermis stores fat and is there for insulation. What is the function of the skin? The functions of the skin, of course, they protect us from pathogens. If you guys remember from the immune system, we said the skin acts as a mechanical barrier, okay, protecting us from pathogens. It's also important for thermoregulation because of sweating and blood flow. So, as I mentioned earlier in the video, if we're in a hot environment, our body is going to respond. We're going to detect this change in temperature and try to respond by sweating, okay, to maintain a stable temperature internally, which is achieving homeostasis, and also blood flow. It can cause vasodilation, allowing excess heat to be removed, or vasoconstriction, cold areas to preserve the heat in our body. And it's also there for sensation, detects touch, pain, and temperature. Now, just small notes, the epidermis protects us against UV radiation. Why is that? Because it contains a pigment which is called melanin, and that absorbs UV light and also there for protection of the cells. And also the dermis, as you mentioned, contains blood vessels, and those blood vessels, of course, are going to provide the cells with nutrients and oxygen, and it also has receptors which detect pressure, temperature, and pain. And we also have hair follicles and sweat glands. Of course, hair follicles produce hair and they regulate temperature. So, for example, if you're in cold areas, you're going to get goosebumps, okay, and then you see your hairs sticking upright. While also sweat glands, they aid in cooling. So in hot temperatures, we're going to sweat, and also in waste excretion. If you guys remember, we talked that sweat is also a form of excretion. And this is just extra information because we've talked about neurons. So one disease is Alzheimer's disease and related to neurodegeneration. So neurodegenerative diseases affect neuron function. We have Alzheimer, which results in memory loss and cognitive decline. Okay, so that's it for today's video. It was a quick video. Make sure you understand the structures and know the labeling. So for the eye, know the labeling of the eye and know the function of each structure, and also pay attention for Accommodation in vision, when viewing a near object or a far object, also focus on pupil reflex and of course the neurons. Okay, so make sure you know the synapse also and the sensory motor and interneuron or relay neuron. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you all for watching and best of luck on your exams.